All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Let's just pray and ask the Lord to bless our study. Lord, we thank you for the Prophecy Conference. We thank you for Prophecy in the News. And we thank you for letting us get together and study your word. We ask that you speak to us by the Holy Spirit. Help us to determine what's right, what's wrong. Help us to learn what you'd want us to do, and help us to use it effectively to witness to others. We thank you for this, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, today we're going to talk about recently fulfilled prophecies. And just to let you know how I got into this, so you can do the same thing, double check me if you want to, which I encourage everybody to do. I got saved when I was 12 and went through several different churches, different denominations, not really noticing much of a difference between them. As I got older, I noticed that they're basically all the same. We all believe in Jesus Christ, crucifixion, salvation, death on the cross, imparting of the Holy Spirit, basically all the same stuff, but there's a handful of little things that we tend to differ on. And I started doing the study on denominations and found there was 158 different denominations. I don't know how many there are now, but back when I was doing it. And they're all minor points, so it's not a really big deal, but I thought, you know, I would like to know the truth on each one of these if possible. And I have a background in computers, and when you have a problem, you just simply write a little program that fixes it. So you just think differently on those things. And so the computer type logic would be, okay, how would you fix this? You go ask Jesus. Okay, he's not here. So second best choice would be to ask the apostles. Well, we have their writings in the New Testament. That's why we all get along as best as we do. But that's what we're talking about. There's little bitty differences in there. So what would the next best thing to do? The disciples of the apostles. Okay, and so that seemed logical to me. If there are any ancient records, then we should be able to go figure this out. So, for instance, if I came to your guys' church, whatever church that is, and I knew nothing about it, and I didn't talk to you or anything, if I could listen to your pastor's sermons, it's going to take a while, but every sermon that he talked about for the last 20 years or so, whatever's available, I would eventually figure out what you guys believe on the rapture, you know, all the different things that we divide over. And I'd be able to figure out, okay, that denomination believes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so that's what I decided to do with the church fathers. Well, we have an existence for the ancient church from basically 30 to about 325 is in a collection of Ante-Nicene fathers. It was published in the late 1800s, about 5,000 pages of their sermons. And you're free to go research it if you want. I don't really recommend that unless you just love to read, and you know, it's going to be lots of good sermons about do what's right and don't do what's wrong and God bless you, and it's good stuff, but just kind of puts you to sleep after a while. But eventually through all that I begin to see how they believed on things. And what's really neat is when you have a problem, and we'll talk about this later, one time there was a guy by the name of Irenaeus that was talking to he was writing a book against the cults of his day. One of the wacky cults had something to do with the 144,000 in the book of Revelation. It's not the one you're thinking of, but it's kind of been coming and going for quite some time. That and 666. And so he was about ready to correct him, and he thought, well, I better double check just to make sure. So he writes this letter to Polycarp and says, just to make sure before I write my cult book, what exactly is the proper interpretation of the 666 thing in Revelation? Polycarp responds by saying, I didn't know either, so I went and asked John. Polycarp, of course, worked with John for 20 years in Ephesus in ministry. He begins to explain to him how to interpret it, how not to interpret it, and those guys were not the fulfillment of it. So he wrote his anti-cult book. But what's interesting, that's just one example of all these things. And if somebody says, if they're trustworthy, and the book hasn't been tampered with, and they say, I went and asked Peter, Paul, John, and Mary, and these people, and they taught me this. And you begin to realize from the first generation up to the first 200 to 300 years, everybody teaches the same thing. Somebody teaches something else, and you're a heretic. I mean, right then and there. Now you get in the 300 to 400s, and somebody teaches something else, it's like, oh, that's cool. And it's like, what happened, you know? But that tells us something really spectacular. You have a basic chronology, you have a basic teaching that's unbroken for 200 to 300 years, and then things change. You know, we talk about the rapture and the tribulation period, the fact that we teach premillennialism. That was taught in the first 3 centuries until the Schism of Nepos in the 300s. So it's all documented. You know who, what, when, and where started the changes. And so that makes it fairly easy to understand. So that answered my question. But there's so much information, I started writing ancient history and prophecy and different things like that. And the church fathers basically taught one thing really interesting. And if you take one thing away from today, I want you to take this one thing with you. And that is, when you study prophecy, try to compartmentalize it. And that's what I did in the prophecy book. There's pre-flood prophecies. There's prophecies in the time of the Exodus, for instance. Exodus chapter 12 says the Exodus was fulfilled to the day. It's like, that's cool. When Elijah was ascended up, have you ever noticed this? Elijah, every time he went around, he had his sidekick with him. And when they all went into a certain city, the sons of the prophets, you all are sons of prophets, by the way. It doesn't mean you're prophets. You love to study prophecy. The sons of the prophets would come up to him and say, hey, you know your master's going to be taken up today? He'd say, yeah, I know, shut up. Just enough. Every time he goes into a city. And we all know that, and it just goes right on by us, but think about it for a minute. How did they all know it was today at 3 o'clock? Somebody made a prophecy. Now, we're not told what day it was or what time it was, but everybody knew. And when it happened, it happened. It's just one more of those prophecies that came to the day. And there's actually quite a few of those. And so they taught to compartmentalize these. The ones that Jesus fulfilled when he came the first time, there's several hundred of those, but you can know all those. He was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, a star was to mark his birth, all those kind of things. There's several in the church age. And they begin to talk about towards the end of time, people would understand them better, and there's only so many prophecies. And some of them, obviously, there's 82 dealing with the tribulation period and the Antichrist. So that's okay. Then there's a bunch of them with the millennial reign. So out of what's left, it deals with Israel most of the time. And the main thing that the church fathers always taught that you take away from this is the fact that you look at places in the Old Testament where God says, I will cause Israel to return, and then I will do blah, blah, blah. And you look at that, and if it says Israel returns from the north country or from Babylon, then I will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That all happened sometime after 536 BC. Okay, so we got that. And then Amos 9 talks about the fact that there's going to be 2 returns. So does Isaiah chapter 12, the time of the second return. And Israel came into their land, established their kingdom, was exiled and returned from Babylon, was exiled under Rome, and came back in 1948. So when it says, I will cause Israel to come back the second time, like Isaiah says, or from all nations, or from the 4 corners of the earth, something like that, that was 1948. So when it says, I'll cause them to come back from the 4 corners of the world, and then I will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are ones that have probably been recently fulfilled, or if not, will be in the next few years. And that's exciting, but that's what the church fathers taught. Compartmentalize these. Look at what you know, and then go forward with that. And so what we want to do today is look at these, some of these recently fulfilled prophecies, and almost everybody recognizes Israel was supposed to come back in their land. So that was an obvious one. And I read commentaries from the last century and before talking about how that's got to be somehow something symbolic with the church, because we all know that Israel can't come back. I mean, no country's ever done that, but that's the point. It's a prophecy. And it's amazing to look at those kind of things and see how Israel did come back and the prophecies that were fulfilled. And so it's really important. So let's just start by looking at some of these. And this actually shows us this is pulled from the book, Ages of the Prophecies that I had. I list 28 prophecies in the first 2,448 years from creation to the Exodus. From Exodus to Babylon, there's over 50 prophecies in 800 years. From the rise of Babylon to when the Messiah came the first time, there was a good 45. You remember all the ones in Daniel about the rise of Babylon and Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome, and then Messiah is born. The Messiah fulfilled well over 122. It depends on how you count them. You know, like there's 6 different places by 4 separate prophets talking about Jesus will be or the Messiah will be a descendant of David. I count that as a prophecy because the descendant of David is a prophecy. I could count it 6 times or 4 times. All depends on how you count it. But at least 100 or more, first time coming. In just the 33.5 years that he was here. The Messiah to the Great Dispersion, that 100-year period from 32 AD to 132 when Israel ceased to exist as a nation. Over 36 prophecies. And then we get to the Great Dispersion. That's the 1816-year time period from 132 to when Israel came back in 1948. We had 24 separate prophecies, some dealing with the church, some with Israel, but during this time. And then Israel comes back. And that's what we want to focus on today. In Israel, there's been over 53s on the list. The book is outdated now. There's been 54. In 62 years, or 63 years, however long it's been. There's another 15, there's 82 in the tribulation, and a few in the millennial reign. So it's just important. That's what the church fathers taught us to do, compartmentalize them. Get all these out of the way, and then what's left, see if it matches recent history. So if we go forward and look at it from there, here's AD 1948. 20 separate prophecies happened that year. Not 1, 20, or at least, as far as I can tell. We start talking about it. Israel will be reestablished as a nation. That's the easiest prophecy. Israel's supposed to come back. Didn't tell us where, when, how, or anything, but that's a prophecy that they will come back sometime. The nation will. That's in Isaiah 11:11. It's also in several other places. Like I say, I count it as 1 prophecy, not 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how many people mention it. That one's mentioned probably a couple of dozen times through the prophets. Isaiah chapter 60 talks about the ships of Tarshish will be the ones to actually bring Israel home and start the nation again. Tarshish is the ancient Hebrew name for Great Britain and those islands. And of course we all know about the Balfour Declaration and those things that actually happened. So second prophecy is that British ships, and this is why it's important to study ancient history. Make sure you know who Gog and Magog is, and Tarshish and all these other ones, Lud, Put. What are those current nations today? Or perhaps, if the nation moved out, where did their descendants go? And know at least a couple of those, so you know it's either these guys or those guys, but it's not someone else. Recently, I talked to someone that was writing a book, actually, trying to figure out who Gog and Magog was. And everybody says it's Russia, but he's like, I can't find any proof. And it's like, well, the book of Jasher mentions that it's Russia, and names the first 3 Scythian kings by name. So it's like that, you know, the ancient history books of the Jews mainly.
What chapter in Jasher is that?
I'd have to look it up. But it's probably chapter 11 or so when the basic nations are being dispersed after the flood. But it's interesting to have that. I mean, that just helps us to understand. Now, if you asked a rabbi, he'd say, yeah, it's southern Russia. But maybe the rabbi's mistaken, you know, not inspired. Neither is Jasher, but the history books help. So Tarshish. Secondarily, Israel was supposed to come back as 1 nation, not 2. There's not supposed to be Israel and Judah anymore. There's just supposed to be 1 nation, and there is. And then next, the nation was supposed to be born in a day by a decree. That's in Isaiah 60, and it was. They sat there for a long time, tried to establish their nation. Finally, the UN decided to vote. And the UN said, okay, you can have your nation. You know, and Israel declared itself as a nation. And immediately war broke out because they won't allow that. So those are the first few. Next, in 1948 still, Israel was supposed to be reestablished under a leader named after King David, according to Hosea. Their first leader was who? David Ben-Gurion, right. Another prophecy. David Ben-Gurion, I don't know if he even knew it, but he fulfilled at least 6 prophecies. Amazing guy. I remember in an interview, they talked to him, it's like, do you really believe in miracles? And his answer was, I'm a Jew. If there weren't miracles, I would not be here. We'd all be dead. You know, so, but you can't go against Russia and the Arabs and this stuff. I'm a Jew. the prophecies. He was a believer. I don't know if he's a believer in Messiah, but he was a firm believer in the prophecies. Today they're like, well, we better do this, otherwise we'll get cut in half and we might cease to exist. Prophecies. Follow, just like in the old times. Do what God tells you, you be fine. It doesn't matter how big their guns are, they'll explode on them or something. It always works out that way. You disobey God, He'll let them take you. So David Ben-Gurion was supposed to, or a guy named David was supposed to be that. The revived state was supposed to be named Israel. My guess is it would be Judah, you know, because the the northern tribes, Israel, kind of apostatized, and Judah kind of stayed somewhat faithful. So my guess is the Jews would come back and say Judah, but no, it's supposed to be Israel. And what's the nation today? Israel. Amazing. Next is the nation was to be reestablished. Or I skipped one. The Star of David would be the symbol for the Israeli flag. It talks about the Magen David, the symbol of the rod of Jesse, being on their national banner. And it is. We've got the symbol of the Star of David on the Israeli flag. And then also we have the prophecy that a nation would be reestablished in the ancient land of Canaan. It's not in Canada. You know, I mean, there's refugees that want to remake a kingdom and they can't go home for whatever reason, and they move. That's happened throughout history. But it's not going to be anywhere else other than in the ancient land of Canaan. And that's exactly where it's at, the ancient land of Israel, or Canaan, or Palestine, or whatever you want to call it, that homeland. Now, I've had people stop me at this point and say, well, if Israel was to come back, what would they have on their flag other than the Star of David? Where would they be other than Canaan? You know, where would they call themselves other than Jews? Logically, this would happen. That's not the point. The point is it was prophesied and it came to pass. How many nations even came back and did anything like that, period, after 2,000 years? None. Why? Well, you can't hold together that long. So that's not the point. And I've been told, well, these prophecies are so specific they're self-fulfilling. So David Ben-Gurion made sure that he was born with the name David. Okay, that's kind of, and Jesus made sure he was born in Bethlehem. And, well, no, his parents did that. Okay, well, you could do that with one prophecy. 122? 53? Man, you got a lot of faith in something else, man. I look at the facts and it's just overwhelming. But they either say that or it's like, oh, it's so vague it could mean anything. It's too specific, it's too vague. Okay, how about I show you a bunch of specific ones and a bunch of vague ones, and not just 2 or 3, how about 50? I mean, let's be open-minded here, as they always say. How many prophecies do I have to show you, written in a book that you know is older than your grandparents? No matter who might have tampered with it, supposedly, but you've seen a King James at least. Your parents probably, grandparents. And you've all been around in your lifetime seeing these things happen. How many of these kind of coincidences do I have to show you to get you to believe? I mean, if the answer is 29 billion and you still won't, there's no use in me talking to you. But just think. And those are the kind of things we look at. So being reestablished in that nation, we go on. 1948 still, the 1 year, Israel was to no longer speak of being freed from Egypt, but being freed from the north countries and all over. And of course that took place. Israel was not to be restored as a monarchy. We'll look at that in just a little bit. The Micah 5 prophecy is incredible for the things going on today. And of course, they've always had kings, right? Except when they've come back, they have elected officials. They call them premiers, you know. Like our president, so elected. Israel was not to be restored as a monarchy. Next one was Israel was supposed to be established on the date predicted. And that's kind of interesting. We have very clearly taught in Daniel that from the going forth of the commandment, so many days the Messiah would come and be cut off. And you can go figure out how to convert that from our calendar to a Jewish calendar, and it comes out to April 6, 32 AD. And even if you don't want to do that, it still says that he's cut off before the destruction of the destruction of the temple, which everybody agrees was Titus 69-70 AD. So the Messiah had to be back there. It's so specific. and so irrefutable that the rabbis said it's a forbidden chapter. Matter of fact, they said anybody that uses Daniel 9 and tries to figure out when the Messiah's come, look at those calculations, you are damned. They placed a curse on you because they don't want people to look at that and think that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, if it wasn't Jesus, it was somebody pre-70 AD. Who was it? He would have done something like revolutionize everything. We'd all know who he is. It wasn't Buddha. Had to been. Now, that's not saying that the Roman Catholic or medieval church is the way it should be, but who else would it have been other than Jesus? So the date for that, we can go back and look. It's kind of cryptic, but it's one of those things that actually comes out to April of, or not April, but comes out to 1948 AD to the day. And same thing when they took back the Temple Mount in 67. It's also the date given. I don't mind setting dates when it's already happened. And we're not talking about the end of the world. If I speculate on that, people, should look at me strange, because we're not supposed to know that. But the other prophecies are specific. And these are hidden enough that it's confusing until after the fact. Just like in Hosea when it says, my son will be called out of Egypt. I read that and think, I don't think of Jesus coming up and going to Nazareth. It's very cryptic until after the fact. And then it's like, okay, I understand that. You don't want Herod figuring that out ahead of time. So there's reasons for some of it to be cryptic. So the Hebrew language would be revived in Israel. And of course, in the early times, and that's what they speak now, Hebrew. And the original language will be the language we all speak at the millennium. That's another prophecy. That's a yet future prophecy. But the revival of Hebrew. Jerusalem would be divided. That's in Zechariah. And Jerusalem was. What happens is they declare themselves as a nation. They're supposed to be in the southern part. Zephaniah says it's for a specific reason that the Lord allows that. And of course now, being history, we know what the reason is. The Arabs have a legend that Jerusalem is a holy city and whoever controls Jerusalem controls everything. It's kind of like a talisman. You control Jerusalem, you can't do anything against me. So they control Jerusalem, the Jews don't, and the Jews whoop them. So much for talismans. It's to let you know that the God of Jacob is the one that's in control. So anyway, we go on and talk about that. Jerusalem would be divided. Jordan would occupy the West Bank, that's in Zephaniah, although it's the ancient names. Evil Moab would be greedy for land and take land, including up to Jerusalem. And of course, they take half of Jerusalem. It's an interesting prophecy we'll get into Sunday morning. But when the Antichrist takes over, remember in Daniel 11, it says he takes over everything, but he cannot, for whatever reason, do anything with Edom, Moab, and Ammon. They escape out of his hand for some weird reason. Well, today, Edom, Moab, and Ammon are combined. They're one country. It's called Jordan. Jordan's where Petra's at. Just thought I'd throw that out. Why he can't do it, I have no idea. It should be easy enough to conquer. But something happens. We don't know everything, but we know a few things. So the West Bank would be occupied, and the West Bank would be created. There's also a prophecy in Daniel 11 about when the Antichrist comes, he will place his headquarters in a land that's between the Holy Mountain and the two seas, which would be somewhere in the West Bank. So the West Bank has to become a sovereign nation in the near future. It's kind of interesting to see those things set up. Why wasn't it named in the Bible? It's not even a nation yet. It hasn't been created. We see it beginning to be. Anyway, as far as recently fulfilled ones, Israel would be restored without Jerusalem, for that reason we mentioned. Israel would have a fierce military. I think it's interesting to me that everybody knows that the superpowers are the ones you don't mess with. United States, Russia, and China. But that's because of their manpower, their technology. Nobody can mess with a nation like that. Pull those out of the equation. Go back to normal nations. Who is the most fierce fighting machine on the planet? It used to be debated. They used to say Israel for technology and maybe Iraq for just sheer manpower on a small nation. So much for Iraq. Israel. You talk about Israeli people coming in and doing stuff. You know, it's always amazing when they finally decide Syria's doing something and it shouldn't, and Israel's, if you don't fix this, we're going to have to come in and do it. You do that, we'll obliterate you. All of a sudden, radar goes dark, nothing works, comes back on, Israel's destroyed the plant. They're not even here anymore. What happened? It's like, that's what kind of stuff happens when the Lord's behind Israel. And again, it's amazing. So this fierce...
Kind of warms you up inside.
Yes, it's nice to see the Lord doing things, whether we like it or not. Nice to see Him in control. Fierce military. Just out of a side note of this, and this is why we need to pay attention to prophecy and take it to heart. If any of you guys in here are interested in studying martial arts, some of you may have studied judo, and that's like a good kind of an exercise type thing, but it's not really a fighting style. Judo's not designed for actually combat, but there's a half a dozen good ones. Now, just out of curiosity, if you believe the prophecies that Israel will be the most fierce fighting power, what would they be doing? Well, Krav Maga. It's an Israeli type of fighting style. So my guess is, if I went and studied that, and you studied judo or karate or something, and then we got into a fight, based on prophecy, I feel pretty confident. So that's the same thing we should do. I mean, like you've heard of these guys that have said, well, the Bible talks about they'll find oil in Israel. And they'll, you know, that it should be there somewhere. Let's go look for it. We'll get rich if we find it, you know. But if it's there, it's there. People are saying, nah, geography's not right for it. Can't be there. Prophecy. I listen to somebody that knows a little more than most people. The Dead Sea Scrolls would be found. In Isaiah, it's really interesting. It talks about the time when the nation is at war, and the ancient ones speak out of the dust of the earth, the ancient prophets. And I thought it was interesting that Israel Yarden was negotiating to try to get the first Dead Sea Scroll, and it was a little too expensive. He had to go back and renegotiate, and finally he got the money to do it. He goes to the university, picks up the funds, drives down, negotiates it, buys the first scroll, starts to come back up and finds he can't go to the university. There's a war of independence. Can't get there. So the same day he buys the first scroll, same day we have Israel born, same day we have the war. Just amazing again. The ancient ones begin to speak out of the dust of the earth. Not ghosts, ancient scrolls. And what was the very first scroll that he purchased? The Isaiah scroll, wasn't it? The prophecies in Isaiah. I just think that's amazing. I always wondered if Isaiah realized when he wrote that, he was writing about himself. Probably not, but that would be pretty cool. Dead Sea Scrolls discovered. Israel was to be reestablished by the fourth craftsman. There's a prophecy about the craftsman in Zechariah. And basically it talks about how there would be four powers to destroy and displace Israel, and Judah, and Jerusalem. And there would be four craftsmen to bring them back. And so we have Egypt trying to put them in slavery, Moses delivering them. We have the Assyrians putting the 10 tribes in slavery, and then Nebuchadnezzar, the southern tribes, and then them coming back under the Maccabees. I think I've forgotten one of them. Oh, Cyrus was one. And then, of course, they're dispersed by Rome, the fourth, and redone by David Ben-Gurion, actually, the fourth craftsman. And so, again, we have these prophecies. So, past 1948, there's not going to be any more expulsions. Now, we're going to have the Antichrist come in. They're going to have the believers flee to Petra for safety. But the nation of Israel is still going to exist. It's not going to be obliterated anymore. The Jewish people would come back originally in unbelief. You know, the prophecy in Ezekiel 37 about the dry bones. They come back together, the sinews, the meat, the skin, but they have no breath. They come back as a nation almost perfect. They just didn't accept their Messiah. But they will in the near future. Not a fulfilled one yet, but a prophecy coming up. Then the first shepherd will arise. We'll come back to that one again. That's 1948, so that's 20 prophecies in the first year of 1948. And it's just really amazing. So then we get all the way over to 1949. And you're saying, wow, this is going to be a long seminar. There's actually not too many of them. That's close to half of them there. But the Yemenite Jews would return. That's in Isaiah 43. And the Yemenite Jews had heard that Israel was back. They had a ruler named David, and they knew that that meant they were going home. And they knew the prophecy said they'd mount up with wings as eagles. They don't know how that works, but they're going home. And then they were told that you guys basically get in this large box and it flies home. They'd never seen one before. But apparently we mount up with wings as eagles and we fly home. So we fly home. So they did Operation, I think it's Operation Solomon, and brought those back to Israel. Again, amazing. 1951, see it's speeding up. Israel would control Ashkelon. It was to be devastated and just set as basically a ruin for a long time until the Israelites would come back and reestablish it. It was reestablished in 1951. 1953, Egypt would no longer have kings. And basically, this is an interesting thing. When the Antichrist comes, Israel will not have kings. And of course, the last king was deposed when Nasser took over, and that was in 1953. Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, we didn't get the verse that came from in the prophecy in the prior 1951.
Oh, okay, Zechariah 9. Yeah, for Ashkelon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Egypt would no longer have kings. So it's an amazing thing. Then in 1967, we have the Second Shepherd War. We'll talk about that in depth in just a little bit. The 1964-67 war would occur on the date predicted. We don't have time to go through all of those, but again, you look at the prophecy, you look at the calendar, and it comes out to be June of 1967. So again, kind of an amazing thing. Isaiah 19 mentions the time when 5 cities will be completely conquered by the Israelites. It's an amazing prophecy. It talks about all of Egypt will tremble, and 5 cities will speak the lip of Canaan that used to be Egyptian. And one of these cities would be called the City of Destruction. And what's amazing about it, in the 1967 war, they took the entire Sinai and they took it by strategically taking certain places to control it. And then one of the major places was a port city called El Arish. And I don't know what it means in Arabic, but those words in Hebrew can mean City of Destruction. So it's amazing that the name of the city is actually even mentioned. And these things happen all the time. Jordan will give up the West Bank at a certain point. They did. It's still sitting there kind of sort of as an independent state, and we know it will become an independent state before the Antichrist comes. The West Bank Jews would be allowed to go back home, and they did at that point. 1968, Israel would control and rebuild Ashdod. Now, Ashdod and Ashkelon are 2 interesting cities. The last time I checked, as of like 2005 or so, Ashdod and Ashkelon were the 5th and 9th largest cities in Israel. I just thought that was interesting. Used to be pretty much nothing, and now they're a very, very large city. Yom Kippur War would occur. We'll talk about that in a minute when we get to Micah. Jerusalem would be a burden to all nations. And of course, that happens with the Arabs. If we say Jerusalem is the capital, gas prices skyrocket. No nation can do that, so officially it's Tel Aviv, even though we all know better. We all have our embassies in Tel Aviv because we can't afford anything else. And that's exactly what was supposed to happen. The shekel would be revived, and eventually the temple too. The prophecy goes on and talks about that. But it's amazing to me, if I take out a shekel and I show it to you, I'm actually holding in my hand a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Isn't that cool? It's just amazing to me. I forgot my shekel, but it's at home safe. 1980s. 1981, the Third Shepherd War. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Back to Micah again. 1982, Israel would give back the Sinai Peninsula. And they did. Not the date or anything, but just the fact that it would occur, and that's when it did. First Lebanese War would occur. Remember them being a fire pot. And in 1989, this is one that people wonder about, the Berlin Wall falling. Where is that in Scripture? Well, again, it's going back to what the ancient names were. Like we said, Tarshish was Great Britain. Gomer is Germany. We have one of Gomer's sons, Ashkenaz, and we know about Ashkenazic Jews, if I'm saying that right, being German Jews, as opposed to Sephardic Jews being Spanish Jews, that kind of a thing. So again, you can go back and look at that, and it says they would be dispersed for a time, and then Russia would gather these together, not as slave states, but as allies. And it's Germany with all of its bands, or Gomer with all of its bands. So East and West Germany had to come back together, to be together, to voluntarily go with Russia in this next war. And so that's what has to happen. So somewhere along the line, the Berlin Wall had to come. I remember when I was in high school and I raised my hand and said, do you ever think that the Berlin Wall will come down, Germany will come back together and start another war? Because we just talked about how it started World War I and World War II. And he's like, no, United Nations will never let that happen. Twice is enough. I'm thinking, prophecies. And now, of course, that's been taken place. 1990, the Ethiopian Jews would be brought back to Israel. This is an amazing prophecy. It's very cryptic at first. It talks about the land that's beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. And you always think, what land is beyond its own rivers? But anciently, the whole area used to be Ethiopia, or Abyssinia. And then something happened, and I don't remember exactly when or where, but it broke, and we have Sudan, and now Ethiopia. So the ancient prophet was telling us it's the Ethiopia that's on the southern side, way before it ever divided. But just to let us know, when it happens, you won't know it's this one, it's this one. But the prophecy is that the Ethiopian Jews then would come, and it's really interesting, in ships that buzz. And there's some translations will translate it paper boats, and it's not paper. If it's a noun, it means paper or reed. But if it's a verb, it means what paper does, which is to soak up water. It's what you use to wipe up water with, is paper towels. And it should be, as the prophecy, a verb instead of a noun. So it's actually talking about they will come home in vessels that have wings that buzz, and it soaks up liquid fuel somehow to make its wings buzz. And so we know that as an airplane. And so I've got a picture in the book of the cargo planes that they used to take the Jews back home with. Again, an amazing prophecy. And we know that the Ethiopians have a gift that will be given in the Messiah when he comes back. It's in Zephaniah. So there's a lot of interesting things with Ethiopia. By the year 2000, this kind of came in stages. It's something. I don't know for sure, but they have something. It's been speculated quite a bit what that might be.
Not till Christ returns.
Well, when Christ comes back and is ruling in Jerusalem, they bring a present of some sort. And I think it's interesting. It's not the Ethiopian Jews, but it's the daughter of the dispersed ones, which probably means the Ethiopian Coptic Church, daughter of the Ethiopian Jews, Possibly. That's my speculation. We'll have to wait and see. But the cities, by the year 2000, the cities were supposed to be restored, and Israel would have non-Jewish farmers. The farmland's usually done by Palestinians. Jerusalem would grow beyond its own walls. That was in Zechariah's prophecy. And again, that happened by the year 2000. Now there's the old city, and the city is north, south, east, and west beyond it. Didn't happen until last century. So it's just amazing. Land of Israel would be divided by its rivers, and there would be pockets of people that hate them there. That's a very odd prophecy, because if they're the most fierce fighting in all of the world, why don't they get rid of those pockets of weird people? Should be fairly easy to do. Politics. They don't want to start another war. Again, they're not thinking of, America, we like you, but shut up. They're thinking more like, well, if we don't have the stuff from America, we may not survive. Again, they're not paying attention to the prophecies. Tourists would actually fly in and support Israel. We fly in as doves and bring money from our kings. It's tourism. is a major thing that supports Israel. But we can't go to a foreign country around Israel and go in because the Muslims just will not do that. You have to fly in. So it's amazing. We fly in like doves. There's supposed to be constant planting and reaping of crops. That happens today in Israel. Isn't that amazing? Forests were supposed to reappear in Israel. And it mentions the cedars and all the different kinds of trees. And it was swampland for a long time, completely done, destroyed. Now the forests are back and the climate is changing. Desolate land and cities would be restored. 5 cities would stay desolate though, even though the rest of them would be restored and renamed to their proper Hebrew names. Ekron, Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Old Tyre. And if we had time to go through those prophecies, they are so specific. It's just amazing. Some people are not even really sure where Ekron's at. But the others are well marked and they're tourist attractions. They're not going to rebuild them because, again, tourism, right? Let's see. Then Muslims would not reckon Israel among the nations. You can go to any Muslim world and look on their map. There is no Israel. They refuse. Israel does not exist. Kind of reminds me of the Buddhists. We are just not here. But anyway, that's the same thing. That's what we have. Israel would inherit the remnant of Edom and which is the Palestinians, the people that are there. And satellite television communication would be invented. We know when the 2 witnesses die, the entire world sees them. And we're thinking, how is that going to ever happen? Not hard now. Used to be quite a bit hard, but satellite TV, radio, internet, cell phones. Everybody gets to watch it. I'm going to be watching it from a higher elevation. But it's really, yeah, soon and very soon. 2004, we're catching up. The Sanhedrin would be reestablished. This is an interesting one because Jesus said in Matthew 24, if you're here during the tribulation and you see the abomination put in the temple, pray that it not be on a Sabbath because you're going to have to run. And if you don't run quickly, even to the point if you go back home to get a coat, you're not going to make it. If you see that, move. And that's his warning. And the believers that are there at that point are going to see it and go, we're following Messiah. We're gone. And so they will probably escape, probably to Petra, like most of us think, or somewhere safe, somewhere outside of the Antichrist reach, probably Jordan. But why did Jesus say that? This is interesting, because right now, if that was the case, I would just hop a bus or a plane and go somewhere. Well, if the Jewish laws were completely back the way they are, and it's a Sabbath, there's no buses, there's no trains, and if you get in a car and start to go, they'll throw rocks at you, because you're breaking the Sabbath. And nobody's going to realize that you have to run now. And so that's going to happen. So somewhere along the line, the Sanhedrin comes back, becomes a power, and becomes at least part of the government anyway, and starts putting these laws back in full force for everyone. That's why it's a danger. In 2004, we had the reestablishment of the Sanhedrin. At first, they are basically laughed at because they have no power. Israel doesn't recognize them. But they were disbanded.